Salva Samra Unscripted. When it comes to Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, I find myself taking a different position from many Christians who have been highly critical of both of them. As an investigative researcher and cultural critic, I don't believe it's wise to dismiss voices simply because they challenge prevailing narratives. My responsibility is to listen, examine, research, verify, and critique. That is my approach, and I take that with every subject or topic I investigate. I want to understand both sides of an argument before arriving at a conclusion. What many people may not realise is that long before Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens began publicly discussing some of the issues they now raise, I had already encountered much of this information through my own independent research. Their willingness to question accepted narratives that didn't introduce me to these subjects, rather it caused me to pay closer attention to their work and examine their arguments more carefully. That doesn't mean that I agree with everything they say. Please understand that, dear viewers. Theologically, I have significant disagreements, particularly with Candace Owens. While she frequently declares that Jesus is King, and while I appreciate her willingness to speak openly about faith in an increasingly secular culture, there are areas where I believe she has embraced positions that are unequivocally unable to reconcile with Scripture. Since she's entered the Roman Catholic Church, she has expressed views regarding Catholic doctrine that I can't and wouldn't ever support biblically. Having been raised myself within both the Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches' doctrine and faith, I speak from personal familiarity and being informed rather than from ignorance or misconception. My disagreements are rooted in theological conviction and biblical examination, also reconciliation biblically. At the same time, I think many Christian critics make a serious mistake when they immediately label everything Candace Owens or Tucker Carlson as conspiracy theorists. That's where I disagree. The loudest critics really take the time to listen to Carlson or Owens consistently. Instead, they frequently construct diluted, selective, or misrepresented versions of their arguments and then proceed to critique positions, that were never actually presented, reducing complex arguments into diluted talking points, creating a version of the argument that's easier to dismiss than to honestly examine. There are aspects of their work that deserve consideration. Tucker Carlson, in particular, appears genuinely committed to asking questions, investigating powerful institutions, and exploring spiritual realities within a biblical framework. Whether one agrees with every conclusion he reaches is a separate matter. What stands out to me is his willingness to wrestle with questions that public figures avoid altogether. From what I've observed, Tucker's spiritual journey appears sincere. He speaks increasingly about the God of the Bible agonizing over truth, morality, evil, and the biblical worldview. I don't agree with every spiritual influence he has entertained or every conclusion. On the contrary, at times, I believe he ventures into areas such as the demonic realm due to an experience he had, which I find concerning, but that's another subject altogether and another story altogether. I'm not talking about that today. There could be various reasons for the personal experience or encounter Carlson had with what he believes to have been demons. Again, not discussing that today. And that would require biblical caution and discernment nonetheless. What I see is evidence of a man searching for truth rather than simply repeating what is politically expedient. Candace Owens likewise deserves a more balanced assessment than she often receives. Truly, while I disagree with significant aspects of her theology, particularly as I shared regarding the Catholic doctrine, I also recognize that she has demonstrated considerable courage in our challenging culture and the lack of questioning narratives that many refuse to question and examine. What initially drew me to Carlson and Owens' work wasn't blind admiration, dear viewers, or ideological agreement. It was the fact that they were raising questions and willing to raise those questions, uncovering issues that I had already encountered through my own independent investigative research. Long before many of these subjects enter mainstream discussion, I had spent considerable time examining the historical, political, cultural, and institutional realities surrounding their claims way back in 1991 and onwards. Rather than dismissing them outright, I choose to continue listening, researching, and testing their claim. And the more I investigated, the more I found that many of the concerns that they were highlighting were and are credible, even amongst the multiple critiques. I'm not one that listens to all the noise and adheres to the popular opinion or belief. I do my own research and discern for myself via the facts accordingly. That doesn't mean they're correct about everything, not at all. No public figure is, viewers, especially when it comes to biblical issues. Everything, and I mean everything, requires to be examined and tested via Scripture and Scripture alone concerning biblical issues. However, it does mean that they deserve to be assessed fairly rather than criticised by those who haven't taken the time to thoroughly examine their work. I've found that some of the most vocal critics within Christian circles often operate from assumption and ignorance rather than careful investigation and discerning knowledge via the facts represented. Too often conclusions are reached before the evidence has been honestly considered, and guilt by association is substituted for genuine evaluation. History repeatedly demonstrates that the truth is really welcome when it confronts entrenched powers or financial interests, political influence, institutional authority, or deeply held assumptions. And I'm all about history. For that reason, I believe claims should be examined on their merits, not rejected simply because they make people feel uncomfortable. In many cases, what appears shocking at first glance is often information that has been hidden in plain sight. overlooked by those unwilling to invest the time required to research and critically examine the evidence for themselves. What attracts millions of people to both Carlson and Owens isn't merely politics. It's their willingness to ask questions that others won't ask in our age of institutional distrust, censorship concerns, media manipulation, and growing public skepticism. People are now gravitating towards individuals who appear prepared to investigate uncomfortable topics and subjects at hand. That doesn't mean they should be followed uncritically, not at all. Every public figure must be tested and every claim must be examined and must be measured against truth and truth alone. I follow evidence wherever it leads and then evaluate that evidence through a biblical lens. Some of what they say I do reject, and some of what they say I affirm. In fact, it's often the claims dismissed as outrageous that I pay the closest attention to. I surely don't accept them uncritically because my work as an investigative researcher and cultural critic requires me to follow the evidence, dear viewers, wherever it leads. Excuse me. Through years of independent research, I've discovered that many of the subjects Carlson and Owens discuss are issues, as I've shared before, I've already encountered long before they entered mainstream conversations. And as I said, it all began in 1991. That reality is what first has drawn me to them and keeps me watching them for investigative research areas. I've found that many people reject claims before they've taken the time to investigate them, while others dismiss them simply because they challenge established assumptions. Genuine research often reveals that some of the most controversial subjects are neither as simple nor as absurd as their critics suggest. The deeper the one investigates history, institutions, these powers, financial interests, and cultural influences, the more one begins to understand that much of what shapes our world remains largely unseen by those who are unwilling to do the necessary homework. My concern is not whether a claim comes from Carlson or Owens, a pastor or a politician, a media organisation or a social media influencer. My concern is whether it is true, whether evidence reconciled with that truth belongs. A good investigator doesn't begin with conclusion, rather they begin with questions. I've found that Carlson and Owens follow evidence where it leads, even when it challenges their own assumptions and their own beliefs or their previous held views. Investigation also requires patience, intellectual honesty, verification, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable facts rather than dismiss them because they don't fit our preferred narrative. It requires examining documents, testimonies, timelines, contradictions, patterns, and context. Most importantly, it requires humility because the truth doesn't belong to us. Our responsibility is to pursue truth, and I do that from a biblical worldview. This is one of the reasons why I've spent considerable time watching both Owens and Carlson over the last year or so. Whether people agree with them or not is beside the point to me. What I've observed is a consistent willingness to ask the questions others won't ask, to follow the leads others won't touch, and examine claims that many people simply accept without scrutiny. Their work isn't built on a single clip, headline, or viral moment. Rather, it involves interviews, documentations, receipts, historical context, competing viewpoints, and an ongoing effort to reconcile information before reaching conclusions, dear viewers. Truly, what fascinates me is how often their critics appear unwilling to do the very thing they accuse others of failing to do. Many will watch a short clip, hear a second-hand interpretation, or consume a hostile commentary and then confidently pronounce judgment. It's absurd. That's not investigation. That's reaction. Genuine investigation takes time. It requires examining the entirety of a topic or matter before arriving at the conclusion. The reason millions of people continue to watch these independent journalists like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson is because they agree with what they're doing and asking the questions, pursuing answers. They see these individuals willing to challenge those powerful institutions out there and digging deep when others would rather move on. And dear viewers, I'll continue to watch Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens because I will not flip them off. I've seen their process, I've watched their research, I've seen their interviews, I've seen the evidence gathered, and in my experience, when criticism becomes relentless and emotional disconnection from the actual evidence being presented, it's often worth paying even closer attention. Truth truly has a way of making people uncomfortable. We all know that. And history repeatedly shows that those who ask difficult questions are really welcomed by those who'd rather those questions never be being asked. I'm fully aware that many of my contemporaries strongly disagree with my perspective, and that is okay. They regard Carlson and Owens as conspiracy theorists, as previously said, or figures unworthy of serious consideration. I understand that. Do I agree with that? Absolutely not. I do understand their concerns, and I understand why many arrive at those conclusions, even though I don't agree with them. However, what I would encourage critics to do is something increasingly rare in our present age: follow the trail of evidence before rendering judgment. It's time-consuming, granted. Don't merely listen to one or two shows, isolated clips, or these hostile commentators or second-hand characterizations. Follow the research. Examine the documents. Investigate the claims. Also, trace historical connections. That is so important to me. I'm all about history, and that's what I do. I look at history, I look at everything from both sides of the coin, and I work accordingly. And it's very time-consuming, granted, and I have to give them the grace, those that do offer their commentary, that they aren't investigative researchers, that they aren't in this line of work. I do give them that grace. But I'm not going to dismiss Owens and Tucker, even though I don't agree with Candace Owens and her Catholicism. I don't agree with that. I know the faith. I know the doctrine. I used to pray the rosary habitually and with fear. Every night, as a little girl and a teenager, I would say 1 Our Father and 9 Hail Marys, and then finished with another prayer. I can't remember. I used to have a rosary hanging on my bedside. The fear that consumed me was huge. And then when I came to understand biblical truth, that just all went away. So even though I don't agree with Candace Owens and her Catholicism, that doesn't mean I disagree with what she's presenting. On the contrary. As for Tucker Carlson, I'm not too sure where he's at the moment. I do see a man who is intellectually pursuing truth. And as a man who is just coming into discovering the truth of the Bible, I give him grace and I say, well done to Tucker Carlson. So I hope this has given you a bit of insight into what my thoughts are about Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens. So again, please subscribe, comment, share so that the algorithms can pick up on this. Until the next time, take care. Au revoir.